Introduction, I'm not sure how to go on. Thank you very much, Jessica. Many years ago, I had to introduce a very distinguished academic in English studies, a person who has edited a great deal of English poetry, Christopher Ricks. I had to do what Askar's just done. And I wrote out this he has had an extraordinarily distinguished career. I wrote out this very long 3 or 4 pages of introduction, praising him, talking about his books and so on and so forth, doing more or less what Askar has just very kindly done for me. And we were sitting together on the stage, and as I stood up to make this introduction, he pulled at my jacket. He clearly wanted to say something, and I leant down, and he whispered in my ear, "Not more than 2 sentences." So, Askar, I wish I'd caught your jacket before. I'm going to talk about, the title of my paper is The Veil of Soul Making, the Persian verse romance from Gorgani to Jami. Now, I realize that there are a lot of people here who know these romances extremely well, but I also realize that there are some people here who don't know them, in fact. So my paper, for those who know the romances very well, my paper is going to have quite a lot in it, which you will think, well, we know that, can we move on to something more esoteric perhaps? But it's necessary in order to, because I don't want half the audience to have no idea what I'm talking about, or anybody actually to have no idea what I'm talking about. So for this reason, I do say quite a lot that some of you will already know very well, and better than I do in some cases, I'm sure. Right, I should begin my actual talk. The Italian medievalist Giorgio Agamben, who has become more famous as a philosopher actually, but he started out as a medievalist, and it's his writings on medieval poetry that I find most interesting. But the Italian medievalist Giorgio Agamben talks about, and I'm quoting in translation, the obstinately contradictory character of Provençal and Dolce Stil Nuovo love poetry. That is the love poetry of the 11th to 13th centuries in southern Europe, as it appears to be, and I'm quoting again, both the transcription of a sensual experience and the site of an exalted soteriological itinerary. End of quotation. The female beloved begins as an object of sensual desire and ends as a means of salvation from sensual desire. We can trace a similar journey in the development of the contemporary, that is 11th to 13th centuries Persian romance, and a further development beyond this stage in later medieval Persian romances, particularly those by Jami, though not exclusively those by Jami. This talk is an attempt to trace this itinerary as it is played out in the medieval Persian verse romance. The added stage is the appropriation of the romance by Sufism, as in the work of Jami, and the way that this transforms both the genre itself and in particular the status and function of the female beloved within the genre. The earliest Persian verse romances that have come down to us are Varghe Golshan by Ayubi, Viceromin by Gorgani, and fragments of Varmeg or Asra by Ansari. Ansari was the poet laureate at the court of Mahmud Ghazni, and Ayubi was associated with the same court. This means that both Ayubi's and Ansari's romances were written around the same time as Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, because we know that Ferdowsi also attempted to obtain patronage from Mahmud Ghazni. And Gorgani's romance was written only a little later, around 1050, that is about 30 years after the death of Ferdowsi. So this clutch of romances, they're all written within about 40, 50 years of each other. When we compare these 3 romances with the love stories in the legendary part of the Shahnameh, not the later part of the Shahnameh, not the quasi-historical part after Alexander, Iskandar, but in the legendary section of the Shahnameh, we see that the love stories in the legendary section and these romances that I've just mentioned, they share a number of similarities, and that these similarities distinguish them from almost all later verse romances in Persian. One thing that they have in common is the forthright decisiveness of their heroines. They are women whose vigorous agency and sense of self-worth is very obvious. To call them tomboys would be a massive understatement. For example, both Golshah and Azra are trained warriors. Golshah uses her spear to kill the man who has tried to kill her lover, Varge, and of Azra we are told, her spear uprooted mountains, her arrows pierced steel, with the result that her father had such faith in her military prowess that he made her the commander of his armies. So these are not shy, retiring women. They are, in fact, warrior women. What is most noticeable about the women in the legendary section of the Shahnameh is their determination to get what they want. And they get it too. Perhaps the most telling example of this sense of their own agency is the fact that in almost all the erotic relationships present in the early part of the Shahnameh, it is the woman who makes the first move. Rudabe sends her maidservants to invite Zal to her palace. Manijeh sends her nurse to bring Bijan to her tent. Tahmineh comes into Rostam's bedroom while he is asleep and offers herself to him. As important as what these women actually do is the lack of any sense in the poems that their actions involve some kind of breach of propriety, that their independence and outspokenness is in any sense unfeminine or unworthy behaviour of a woman. It's also noteworthy that in all three of these relationships, the lovers sleep together before they are married. And Rostam and Tahmineh, of course, never do marry, although, as everyone knows, who knows the Shahnameh, there is an interpolated passage in which they very improbably marry, in fact, before they make love. This was quite early on realised. It was quite early on realised that this was an interpolation. And when the famous Florence manuscript was discovered of the Shahnameh, it's absent from that manuscript, but somebody has kind of penciled it in the margin, as it were. But it's not in the actual manuscript itself. There is no fuss in these stories, for example, about preserving one's virginity. The subject never comes up. All that matters in these tales and in the independent romances written around the same time is that the heroine's true love must be the first and only person she sleeps with. And whether this happens within or outside of marriage is largely irrelevant. Later on, of course, in, for example, the romances of Nizami, virginity and its preservation before marriage become a major concern. It's also noticeable that there is no hint whatsoever in the Shahnameh tales that the lovers and their love for one another represent anything other than their physical selves and worldly physical relationships. I say this parce the isolated attempt by Sohrawardi, who as a contemporary of Nizami read at least parts of the Shahnameh, as it were, in Nizami-esque terms, and tried to give some moments in the poem's legendary section an allegorical spiritual meaning. He does this particularly with the story of Zal. But I think he's had few followers in this. Most readers of the Shahnameh, I think, don't feel that these love stories represent anything other than the literal, physical love that they describe. Although it's clear from the few lines that Ferdowsi gives to the embraces of Zal and Rudabe and Bijan and Manijeh that we are to understand that the lovers delighted in each other's physical presence, Ferdowsi is notoriously reticent about describing physical love. You feel he'd much rather be describing two men fighting each other on the battlefield than a man and woman making love to one another in bed. Matters are quite different in Gorgani's Vis and Ramin, the poem that was written around 1050, in which sexual desire and sensual pleasure are openly celebrated at length. In one way, Vis and Ramin is, I think, virtually unique among Persian verse narratives in that its central character is a woman, Vis, whose inner life is presented in great detail and with avowed authorial sympathy. Beside her, her lover Ramin is something of a cipher, virtually a stock figure, while Vis, along with her desires, misgivings and triumphs, is lavishly and sympathetically portrayed. Vis is as feisty, forthright and determined to get her own way as any of the other heroines I've mentioned so far. The first time we hear her speak is when she rages against her mother for promising her in marriage to someone before she is even born. And when her mother, who is as decisive and strong-minded as her daughter, virtually sells Vis to Mubad, who is the king to whom she'd been promised, in her fury and desperation, Vis orders her nurse to make a talisman which will render her husband impotent with her, as she has no intention of sleeping with him. This is not because she is in love with Ramin, as yet she is hardly conscious of his existence, but partly because she is already married to her brother. I leave that aside. A and mainly because she cannot stand the thought of being married off to someone she has neither seen nor chosen. This talisman ruse is of interest in that it is an example of the common makrizan, or deviousness of women topos, that abounds in both Christian and Islamic medieval literatures. But it's a topos that is typically deployed as a warning for any given tale's male audience. That is, it's saying to the men, be careful of women, they play tricks on you, you can't trust them. In Vyse's case, though, there is no sense of authorial condemnation of the ruse. Gorgony refuses to judge his heroine either explicitly or implicitly, and this lack of condemnation stays apparently unchanged when he is describing the many other ruses that Vyse deploys to ward off and placate Mobad at various points in the narrative. An erotic relationship, or the desire for one, presupposes two people, and the medieval norm, at least in poetry, was that the man did the desiring and the woman was the object of desire. I'm talking about narratives here rather than ghazals, obviously. She became the site, as it were, on which his desire was centered. It was she, and especially her beauty, that aroused his desire. A very common metaphor was that of a hunter and his prey, and often the prey escaped, that is, the man was evaded or rejected by the woman. There was a variant to this norm, which was that although the woman begins by rejecting her pursuer, once she has actually seen him, she becomes as invested in the hunt as he is, and the two become both hunter and prey. A classic example in medieval English literature is Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside. Cresside is vehement about her lack of interest in Troilus until a go-between contrives to place her where she will actually see him. And as soon as he comes into view, she says, "Who gaf me drinka?" which means, who gave me the love potion? How is it that I'm falling in love at this moment? It's a lovely moment in Chaucer's poem. That is, who gave me the love potion. Her desire for the relationship to be consummated is now as strong as Troilus's is. Exactly the same thing happens in Vyse and Ramin. Vyse is vehement about her lack of interest in Ramin until the nurse contrives to place her where she catches sight of him. And immediately she says to herself, how would it be if I allowed Ramin to sleep with me? Although both Cresside and Vyse argue strenuously with themselves as they are aware that their desire flies in the face of social convention, once the beloved is seen, they are caught, and they will become as much the pursuer as the pursued. That is, there is an equality in the relationship that is absent in the more conventional situation in which man loves woman and the woman may, probably will not, accede to his wishes. The woman's desire now becomes as important, as overwhelming and irresistible, and crucially as valid within the world of the poem as the man's. And in both Troilus and Cresside and Vyse and Ramin, it is celebrated as such. There is no suggestion that female sexual desire outside of marriage is somehow intrinsically, in and for itself, wrong or evil. Society may say it is, but the poem validates it. And in fact, Gorgany's poem validates it even more than Chaucer's does. Chaucer's heroine Cresside is punished and comes to a bad end. Vyse triumphs, marries Ramin, and they live happily ever after. Vyse and Ramin is extraordinary precisely because it celebrates female desire and sexuality as such. The social norms that insist they can only exist within marriage are presented as an obstacle to what the poem celebrates, not as a condition of its existence. Like the heroines of the legendary section of the Shahnameh, Vyse and Ramin sleep together before marriage, and in fact they do so at every opportunity that presents itself. And if society and Vyse's husband Mobad disapprove, so much the worse for society and Vyse's husband. And again, as with the stories that deal with erotic relationships in the legendary portion of the Shahnameh, there is no suggestion whatsoever in Vyse and Ramin that their love has any allegorical meaning, which can rewrite the physical as merely the vehicle that is present to convey a spiritual message. Their physical love for one another is simply itself, and it is, I believe, impossible to see it as a metaphor for something otherworldly or in some other nebulous sense transcendent of physical reality. We can say that in terms of her life narrative, the whole point of Vyse's erotic life is that it is transgressive of the mores of the society in which she lives. And it is this outsider transgressive status that fuels much of the narrative tension of the poem. She ought to act in one way, no matter how difficult and heartbreaking this might be for her, and instead she blithely and determinedly acts in a completely different, self-gratifying, and socially reprehensible way. I think we can be fairly sure that it was this disregard for normally accepted boundaries of behaviour, the way that Wyss breaks society's rules and nevertheless emerges triumphant. I think we can be sure that it was this that finally determined Nezami's apparently negative attitude towards Gorgani's poem. But Wyss and Ramin clearly loomed large in Nezami's imagination. After all, it was, as far as we know, the greatest verse romance to have appeared in Persian before Nezami came on the scene. And as he set himself the task of composing verse romances, he could not but be fascinated by it. And so, not surprisingly, his debts to it are, as is well known, considerable. I'll list a few of them quickly. Most obviously, there is the long Paraklasi Thuram, the lover's lament outside the beloved's door, conducted by Khosrow outside Shirin's castle, in imitation of Ramin's lament outside Wyss's castle, together with the fact that both these scenes occurred during a snowstorm. What confirms that this is indubitably Nezami's imitation of Gorgani's scene is the fact that snowstorms are to be expected in Marv, in Central Asia, where Wyss's castle is, whereas they seem very unlikely outside of Shirin's castle, which we have been told is located in the hottest and driest area of Khuzestan. Though this is the most obvious example of direct imitation, there are a number of others present in Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin. These include the marriage of the hero to someone other than the heroine and his subsequent regret, the bed trick, somebody else is substituted in bed for the person that X thinks he is sleeping with. This occurs once in Gorgani's poem and 3 times in Nezami's poem. And perhaps most significantly, the revelation of a lover's true feelings through song rather than directly. This is a momentary incident in Wyss and Ramin, but one that Nezami transforms into a prolonged major scene that happens at a crucial moment in his narrative. But despite the fascination that the poem held for him, it is, I think, clear that Nezami thought of Wyss and Ramin as a morally obnoxious work. If he took it in some sense as a model, we are forced to assume it was a model that he was intent on cleaning up, and in his terms, civilizing it. That is, rendering it morally amenable to the avowed social mores of medieval Islamic society. The fact that Wyss and Ramin takes place in a pre-Islamic society is everywhere evident throughout the poem. There's the fact that Wyss is married to her brother, for example. That couldn't happen, clearly, in an Islamic society. But it is a circumstance that it happens in a pre-Islamic society that can be easily forgotten when one is reading much of Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin. But the only significant non-Islamic thing that happens in most of Nezami's poem is that everyone seems to drink far too much. But of course, this was not unknown behaviour in many Islamic courts in the Persianate world. So its presence in the poem doesn't really remove the atmosphere of Khosrow and Shirin very far from a familiar milieu in the courts of Nezami's own time. It's easy to read Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin and forget that it's set in pre-Islamic Iran. You could never forget this whilst reading Wyss and Ramin. As a poet, Gorgani was a brilliant entertainer who wrote a tale that seemed to celebrate transgressive sexual behaviour, and it was set in pre-Islamic Iran. This setting, the context of the poem's episodes, explained the immorality, and in so doing made it unthreatening for his audience, so that they're able to participate in it, but only at a distance. It doesn't mean that Gorgani was recommending this behaviour, which was behaviour that couldn't be emulated in the real world in which he and his audience lived, or it shouldn't be. But Nezami was a didactic poet who wanted his poems to exemplify codes of behaviour that could and should be emulated in the real world. And herein lies the crucial difference between these two poets. The great stumbling block in Islamic terms of Wyss and Ramin was the behaviour of Wyss. Wyss is mentioned twice in Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin. The first time this occurs is when a woman who is characterised as a prostitute is compared to her. Her honeyed kiss and her flirtatious glance made her as Wyss was in the old romance. The second time occurs when Shirin is admonishing herself not to give in to Khosrow's demands, since if she does, I'll be like Wyss, a byword for my shame, and I'll have lost forever my good name. Wyss is present in Nezami's Khosrow and Shirin as the paradigmatic example of everything a romance heroine should not be. I said a few moments ago that Wyss and Ramin is primarily a poem about Wyss, since she is where all the real interest of the poem lies, both for us and I believe for Gorgani himself. Khosrow and Shirin is more obviously a poem about two characters, about both of the lovers almost equally. But only almost, since the real interest of the poem lies in the character of Khosrow. And we know this because although Shirin's character virtually never varies throughout the whole poem, and this steadfastness is presented as admirable in every way, Khosrow's character changes as the poem proceeds. And the process of this change, the why and the how of it, is the real subject of the poem. It's what the poem is about. Shirin's role is indispensable in all this. She is the means, the model, the exemplar, the educator, in fact, who demands and instigates this change in Khosrow. In erotic terms, she is the woman who leads Khosrow away from concupiscence, whereas these had been more than ready to share in Ramin's concupiscence, since both she and Ramin refused to see it as such. For Shirin, social rules may have been a nuisance, and they could be pushed and pulled and stretched to some degree, but their fundamental validity is never in question for Shirin. And one of her preoccupations becomes the necessity of convincing Khosrow that they apply to him too, despite all his royal and excessively masculine impatience with them. Khosrow's childhood and youth are described in almost completely formulaic terms. His prodigious physical and mental precociousness, which mark him out as the wonder of his generation, these are to be found in the childhood and youth of any number of heroes in medieval Persian narratives, most obviously in the Shahnameh, for example, in the childhood and youth of Rostam, which Nezami indicates was his primary source for Khosrow and Shirin. But as soon as Khosrow begins actually to act in the world, the descriptions of his behaviour are not at all formulaic. His acts individualise him for the reader, and it's soon clear that he is not a particularly admirable individual. His first act is to go on a hunting expedition, and before the expedition gets underway, his father, King Hormuz, has promulgated a new set of laws aimed mainly at protecting his kingdom's less powerful subjects from exploitation by those who think they can act with privileged impunity. During his hunting expedition, Khosrow and his entourage are shown breaking all these laws one by one, so that the first thing we see Khosrow doing is thoughtlessly flouting social rules. Not surprisingly, his father summons him for punishment, but in the event Khosrow acknowledges his faults and presents himself as so suitably contrite that not only does he go unpunished, but is given command of the royal armies and becomes a kind of de facto king, even though his father is still alive. In the course of what is perhaps the most famous scene in the poem, Khosrow's first glimpse of Shirin occurs when he sees her bathing in a pool far from any kind of civilized environment, that is, literally in a state of nature. Shirin sees that she has been seen, and she reacts with alarm and embarrassment. And here, Khosrow's courtly education kicks in. His upbringing implied that self-control should douse the fire of lust within his soul, and chivalry now urged him not to stare, but quickly redirect his gaze elsewhere. He starts the scene as something of a lout, by gawping at a naked girl. But he then remembers that this is not how one is supposed to behave, and he acts accordingly. And so Khosrow's first sight of Shirin is also the moment when we begin to witness that the amelioration of his character has at least started. But he still has a long way to go. He arranges the death of his rival, Farhad, for Shirin's love, and then he spitefully mocks Shirin when she grieves for him, and he even goes so far as to accuse her of having killed him. He can be coarsely sexist, even by medieval standards, as when he asks assembled kings to name the country with the sexiest girls. His male vanity is embarrassingly crass. He wants his lovers to tell him that he's the best lover they've ever encountered. Those bits are really embarrassing. Oh, stop it, for goodness sake. As soon as he gets Shirin to admit she loves him, he goes off to someone he has heard is the most desirable whore in the world. He is in so much need of borrowed courage that even when he goes to Shirin's castle, he gets himself so drunk that she won't admit him. And on his wedding night, for goodness sake, he drinks so much that he passes out, to his bride's understandable disgust. Shirin's major concern is, of course, to educate him in his attitude towards her, to transform his selfishness and thoughtless hedonism into respect for her as a person, to recognize her own individual reality as separate from his and not merely as an adjunct to his own ends. that is, to see her as an end in herself, rather than as something to overcome, possess, and for all she knows, discard, which is how he seems to be for a good half of the poem or so. This becomes most apparent in her refusal to sleep with Khosrow until they are married, unlike in the earlier romances that I was talking about. She wants to be his wife, not his concubine, to be abandoned when he has no more use for her. And she is determined to act as her aunt, Mahim Bonu, has advised her, don't let him eat your halva and not pay you. The obstacles to love for Vis and Ramin are, we can say, entirely social. In itself, their love for one another is more or less mutual and equivalent. The main obstacle towards the consummation of Khosrow and Shirin's love is not so much social. Shirin isn't married to anyone else, for example. Is that Shirin demands evidence that Khosrow loves her in the same way that she loves him, something that she wishes to believe, but which his behaviour keeps suggesting is not at all the case. And in fact, Khosrow at one point attempts to rape Shirin, and this is very graphically described, something Ramin never does or needs to do, since Vis is always compliant to his wishes. Ramin's lust is indistinguishable from his love. For him they are the same thing, a concupiscent desire for the other to be always there and always available. There is no real sense of sin in Gorgani's poem. Social transgression, yes, but not complacent evil. And we can say an adequate consideration of such ethical or spiritual notions is outside of Gorgani's remit. They're not what his poem is concerned with. But there is a very strong sense of sin in Nezami's poems. And one of the lessons Shirin teaches Khosrow is to realize that lust and love are not at all synonymous. In fact, they are potential enemies of one another, in that lust is for oneself and love is for the other. Shirin emerges in the poem as Khosrow's educator. She is quite literally the means by which he becomes a better person. In Nezami's poem, the female ennobles the male. And this is not only the case in matters to do with love and eros. It is Shirin who, by saying that she will only become Khosrow's wife once he has defeated the rebel battle on Shubin, that forces him to make plans to confront his hitherto successful enemy. And it is Shirin who, once they are married, as the wise sage Bazod Omid instruct Khosrow in the ways of justice and good government, with the clear implication that he hasn't been a particularly just king up to this point. Shirin's education of Khosrow finally comes down to one thing. The good man does not live for himself, but for others, whether this be politically, socially, or personally. And Nezami emphatically underlines this transformation in Khosrow's last moments. Khosrow has been mortally stabbed while Shirin sleeps beside him, and his first thought is to wake her in order that she help him and save his life. But then he thinks how desperate and distraught she will be to see him in such a state, and he decides it is better to bleed to death and not disturb her than to attempt to save his life by waking her. In death, he shows her in the most dramatic and self-sacrificing way possible that he has learned the lesson she has been inculcating in him ever since their first meeting. Live for others, not for yourself, even if this means your own death. Shirin is her own person and is strongly characterized as such. But insofar as she represents an abstraction within the poem's didactic structure, she is the educative embodiment of spiritual growth, the means by which the male itself is purified and made worthy of the beloved, whose physical beauty is an aspect of her spiritual beauty. There is a considerable distance between Nezami's poetry and Jami's, not only in terms of the time past. Jami was born a little over 200 years after Nezami's death, but also in terms of the two poets' preoccupations and the general ethos of their poetry. But despite the fact that a number of romances were written in Persian during the intervening period, a couple of which are going to be discussed in this conference, there is no romance poet of comparable stature to Nezami before the appearance of Jami. And so a comparison of the two seems appropriate, and even seems to be invited by Jami, in that his Haftarang looks like a deliberate parallel to, not to say a challenge to, Nezami's Khamseh. Two of Jami's poems deal with the same subjects as two of Nezami's, the Alexander legend and the tale of Lady and Majnun. As we're dealing with love stories at the moment, it's interesting to put Jami's Lady and Majnun next to Nezami's. There are some noticeable plot differences, the most important of which is perhaps that Nezami's Lady dies before Majnun, whereas Jami's Majnun dies before Layli. But the most telling difference is, I would suggest, in the way that Layli and the nature of her love for Majnun are presented by the two poets. We first see Nizami's Layli as a child, that is, as a pre-sexual innocent. But we first see Jami's Layli as a grown woman, and furthermore, one who is stereotypically flirtatious towards Majnun. The words associated with Layli at this moment are Naz, Kereshme, and Eshvebazi. The word associated with Majnun when he becomes aware of Layli's attention is Pak-Bazi. So there is a clear distinction between the attitude towards Eros of the two of them as soon as they become aware of one another. Or in other words, insofar as anyone comes onto anyone, she comes onto him. Not unlike the heroines in the love tales and the legendary section of the Shahnameh. But unlike the heroes in those same Shahnameh tales, Jami's Majnun's outward response is decidedly proper, correct, and socially appropriate. It's not at all sexual, despite the inner turmoil Bakame Eshk he begins to experience. Shortly afterwards, Majnun makes some curious remarks about women and love, and because the remarks are quite ambiguous and significant for what happens later in the poem, I will translate as literally as possible. When I read these remarks, I was quite astonished by them, and I thought, what does this mean? And in fact, it can mean two things. I'm translating as literally as possible. Men are in every way fortunate in their spirit. Poor women, their wings are tied down. Love's appearance is not women's business. A woman is not in charge of herself. The Persian for that is Zan Maleke Karihishtan Nist, which can mean two different things. It can mean that somebody else is controlling her, but it can also mean she can't control herself, that is, she can't control her emotions. She's not in charge of her own sort of psychic state. When love makes its appearance in men, this is an excellence. When love makes its appearance in women, this is a fault. The word for excellence that I've translated as excellence here is honar. Fault is aib. That is, love is seen as an aib, a fault, even in medieval terms, a sin in a woman. A generous interpretation of this passage, from our point of view, perhaps from a modern point of view, let's say, would be that Majnun is saying, poor women, society won't let them be themselves. They're not under their own control, and they can't indulge their feelings as men can. But another interpretation is that Majnun, or Jami through Majnun, is saying, poor women, this is how they are. That is, they are tied down. They are unable to rise beyond the physical world. They are unable to restrain themselves, and love can only lead them to transgression and sin. All this is not just how society sees them or constrains them to be, it's their essential nature. So that Jami seems to be saying, men are fine fellows and love can make them even finer. But women are earthbound, not in control of their emotions, and love produces reprehensible things in them, not the excellence that it can produce in men. And in fact, it is this latter interpretation, which is fundamentally condemnatory, or at the very least disdainful towards women, that the rest of Jami's version of the Layli and Majnun story seems to confirm. Before Jami's Majnun dies, he is instructed in the nature of love by a Sufi, who tells him that he has been bewitched by an unreal figure, a mujaz of love, that is Layli and the effect she has had on his soul, not by love's reality. And he must now pass to the reality of love, its hagigat, which is the abandonment of the self, so that he will be lost to the world of physical appearances of which Layli was a part. In terms of Majnun's spiritual growth, the best we can say for Layli is that she has awakened him to love, but that it's a false love, and is only a stage from which he can aspire to the reality of true, that is, divine love. As for Layli herself, there is no such revelation or flight from the physical world to the realms of mystical insight. Layli imagines that death for her will mean that she will be reunited with Majnun in the afterworld, where we shall take one another's hands and rise together hand in hand, and take our place beside one another and abide together in happiness. Her notion of death, is in fact very close to the vision of Layli and Majnun in heaven, which comes at the end of Nizami's version of the story. It's very close indeed. But Jami's Majnun has already passed beyond this counterfeit Mojazi love, which Layli imagines as persisting after death. And so Layli's version of their shared future existence together can only be an illusion, another instance of what is imagined rather than what is real. As was said by Jami / Majnun near the beginning of the poem, Layli's wings are tied down. She cannot fly beyond the world of appearances, as Majnun can and does. The demotion of women, vis-à-vis men, that's what we want to call it, together with a forthright and unambiguous condemnation of female sexuality and desire as such, is most obvious in Jami's Salaman and Absal, which is a quite extraordinary poem. As this romance is not especially well known, I'll briefly summarise its plot, which is a very strange one. In a way, we can say it's a romance that, insofar as it can, is trying very hard not to be a romance at all. The story takes place in Greece and was in origin a Greek legend, which is in itself significant, as Jami's treatment of it is steeped in the vague and widely diffused medieval Islamic elaboration of Neoplatonism that accorded all real value to the life of the spirit and all evil to the existence of the material world, including the human body and its desires, which were regarded as being, in the final analysis, merely illusory. When the central character of the poem Salaman is being described as an extraordinarily beautiful, accomplished and wise young man, it's said of him that when he explained Greek philosophy, which in Jami's terms would be Neoplatonism, the Greeks themselves would praise him. The tale begins conventionally enough with a king wishing to have a son, and his advisor, who is described as a hikmat-shanas, a man of wisdom, tells him that the customary way to have a son is through sexual passion, shahvat. You'd think the king would know that, but anyway. But that this passion makes blind the eye of knowledge and reason, and that whoever drinks a drop of sexual passion's wine never sees deliverance from it. And this remark leads on to an extensive condemnation of women who are the site of such passion, and who are, according to this hekmat-shanas, lacking in reason and religion, to which he adds that no one ever sees anything from them but tricks and treachery. That is, we're back with the makrizan topos, but here it's definitely seen as something that's evil in a woman. To clinch his argument, either the hekmat-shanas or Jami himself, as is often the case in Persian romances, it can be hard to tell whether we are to take a speech as being said by a character in the poem or by the poet in propria persona. But whichever it is, the person says that Ferdowsi himself cursed women and added that among just men, women were worthy of such curses. In Ferdowsi's defence, I hope it's unnecessary to add that the lines disparaging women found in some late manuscripts of the Shahnameh are now dismissed as spurious additions by later copyists. Nobody believes that they're actually by Ferdowsi anyway. But having roundly condemned sexual desire and the women who embody it and cause it, the advisor says that there is a way to have a son without involving a woman. And by some unexplained method, he extracts the king's sperm, bi-shahvat, without passion, and places it somewhere equally unexplained, but not in a woman's womb, so that after 9 months a son appears in the world. However, it seems impossible to keep women out of the picture entirely, since the baby, who is Salaman, now needs a wet nurse, and a young woman who is less than 20 years old is found to fulfill this function. This is Absal, whose extraordinary beauty and sexual attractiveness are described at considerable length. When Salaman reaches the age of 14, which in keeping with medieval convention is regarded as the age of maximum physical attractiveness in both men and women, she sets about seducing him, so that we have an example of the common ancient trope of an older temptress who attempts to seduce a younger man, over whom she has some legitimate control. As does Sudabe with Siavash, as does Zuleika with Yusuf, as does Phaedra with Hippolytus. Absal is successful, and as a kind of confirmation of the man of wisdom's warning about women's sexuality and their wiles, Salaman begins to neglect everything else in life except his passion for his seductress. Both his father and his father's advisor remonstrate with him and try to convince him that his love for Absal is a love for something worthless. As the advisor says, "What is that superficial beauty filled with shame and sin? Neither her skirts nor her heart are pure or without lust." But Salaman's response is that he is powerless to resist his desire for Absal. He and Absal then sail across the sea to the island of the Joy, Jazireya Khoran it is called, which is kind of equivalent to the Greek isle of Cythera, the birthplace of Aphrodite, and a place of endless physical beauty and pleasure. But the king is able, by the magical force of his telepathic will, to prevent Salaman from approaching Absal, who returns to his father and begs for forgiveness. Salaman becomes contrite, and although he rejoins Absal, it is only to persuade her that as they cannot live together, they should light a huge fire in which they will both be immolated, so that they will die together. But when they enter the fire, although Absal is burned to death, Salaman survives, as if, Jami says, he is gold that has been purified in the flames. This is reminiscent of Jami's Majnun, when he had said that love-longing in a man can lead to nobility, but for a woman it is only destructive. However, Salaman still has not overcome his love for Absal, and he cries out to her, "Would that I were with you and had trodden the way into nothingness." But then the king's wise advisor, the Hikmat Shanas, creates for him a vision of ethereal and spiritual heavenly beauty, in the contemplation of which Salaman forgets his preoccupation with the physical beauty of Absal. This heavenly beauty, he is told, is called Zohre, Venus, but it is a Zohre that is precisely heavenly, immaterial. The beauty of this heavenly vision washed the image of Absal from Salaman's heart, so that all his love was concentrated on the heavens. He saw eternal beauty and flew beyond nothingness. He chose eternal happiness rather than transient earthly happiness. That is, Salaman is led from his love for physical beauty, as it is embodied in Absal, which is merely a counterfeit beauty, to a love for true beauty, which is entirely spiritual and heavenly. Just as Jami's Majnun had been led from his love for Layli to his love for the divine vision described by the Sufi, who advises him at the poem's end. Both Salaman and Jami's Majnun leave behind their earthly loves, as it were, who are in each case implicitly regarded as unworthy of the vision vouchsafed to the two male protagonists. This is in contrast to Nizami's Layli and Majnun, who we are given to understand both achieve the same spiritual level at their poem's end, as is evidenced by their mutual companionship in heaven. My conclusion. The figure of the female beloved makes an extraordinary journey in the course of the development of the medieval Persian romance. She begins as a woman with her own emotions, passions, and sexual desires, all of which are seen as perfectly legitimate in their own terms. She then becomes somewhat secondary to the male protagonist, but she is still a positive figure, as she is the means by which a man's character and soul are purified and ennobled. She exemplifies the ideal towards which he must strive if he is to make anything truly worthwhile of his life. She ends as the embodiment of sexual lust, which is condemned to poor, and as a figure who can only lead men astray and blind them to the reality of true love, which is asexual and is apparently a vision that lies beyond the grasp of her capabilities. From the point of view of Zan Zendegi Azadi, this is a journey that seems to be going in entirely the wrong direction.